A bomb that went off yesterday in the van driven by the wife of Navy Captain Will Rogers. But it was revealed today that Rogers had used the van just before the bomb went off and had received death threats after his ship accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner in July. We have a report on today's developments from CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen.
A team of FBI explosives experts sifted through the rubble at the bomb site today, trying to learn more about the device that destroyed the van driven by the wife of Navy Captain Will Rogers, trying to learn if it was a terrorist attack aimed at the skipper of the missile cruiser that shot down an Iranian passenger jet last summer.
We are into an exhaustive, painstaking, lengthy analysis to determine what type of bomb it was, what was used in the bomb, how it was detonated. There are fragments, certainly you're aware of, that would lead one to believe this is a pipe bomb.
Sharon Rogers, alone in the vehicle at the time, escaped unharmed and with her husband today remains under protection at their suburban San Diego home, the neighborhood sealed off. There are published reports that Captain Rogers and his wife received several threats after last summer's Persian Gulf tragedy, when the Vincennes mistakenly shot down the Iranian passenger jet, killing all 290 civilians on board. One telephone threat reportedly came to Rogers just 24 hours before last December's bombing of the Pan Am jet over Lockerbie, Scotland. And security experts say yesterday's bombing has all the appearances of a terrorist strike.
It would strain credulity to believe that it is anything other than retaliation for the incident in the Persian Gulf.
Is it a connection that was deliberately planned and executed, or is it something that is much more ad hoc? Something that individuals took upon themselves, and individuals who may well be legal residents of the United States.
In San Diego late today, California Senator Pete Wilson said the initial evidence points away from somebody acting on direct orders from Iran.
The information that's preliminarily available sounds like it's somebody acting independently.
Wilson did not elaborate, and the FBI would not comment. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
A machinist strike against Eastern Airlines entered its second week today. The strikers were joined by their families on the picket lines. The company announced plans to expand its schedule, and the public took advantage of discount fares. Mark Phillips reports.
In Boston, New York, and Washington today, crowds thronged to the Eastern Bargain Basement shuttle. At $12 a seat, it's a student on spring break's dream.
At $12, you really can't beat the price.
Go over to Pan Am. That $12 doesn't mean that much.
Despite the advice, the shuttle passengers were allowed free passage across the Union picket lines, where today was Family Day. Eastern employees supported by their children, husbands, and wives, and by members of other unions.
I hope it sends a good message back, and I hope he gets it.
He is Frank Lorenzo, head of Eastern's parent company, Texas Air, and he has raised the ante again in this already bitter strike. Eastern has announced it will resume service to 13 Latin American destinations.
We have at this point over 200 pilots, both management and line pilots, who are flying.
And Eastern says it's receiving hundreds of calls from other pilots who are also ready to fly. But the vast majority of the 3,600 striking pilots seems to be standing firm.
They said, we're going to operate Eastern, no problems.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. Again, they're talking about it. They don't know what they're talking about.
That's probably their only shot at winning this situation, is to stay unified, stay out, and force the creditors to put the pressure on Texas Air Corps to sell.
Eastern says its attempt to get even 10% of its flights into the air is a way of showing that it's still in business despite its bankruptcy declaration. But at $12 a seat on its shuttle flights, it's more of a bargaining tactic than a money-making business. For the gamble to work, Eastern has to get 80 more planes into the air starting tomorrow. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Miami.
The death toll rose to 24 today in the crash of a Canadian airliner. The plane went down yesterday just after takeoff from Dryden in the rugged, snow-covered western Ontario regions. Gary Reeves was at the crash site.
At first light, rescue crews scrambled back to the snowbound Air Ontario crash site, hoping that some of the 22 missing victims had survived the frigid night.
There was no findings of anyone who survived through the night.
The mid-sized jetliner, a Dutch-built Fokker F-28 carrying 65 passengers and a crew of 4, had just taken off when it dipped a wing, clipping some trees before finally plowing into a forest just 1/2 mile from the runway. 24 people, including 3 crew members, were killed.
There was so much fire. The plane was full of snow. Most people were yelling, screaming, and just scrambling.
2 people with various burns all over their faces were wandering aimlessly.
About half of the injured were treated and released. The rest remain hospitalized, but all are expected to survive. This was the first commercial jet to crash in Canada in 10 years, and the first time a Fokker F-28 has ever gone down in North America. The plane was 16 years old, but airline officials believe it was in excellent condition. While investigators comb the site for clues, some of the passengers have suggested the plane was too heavy, saying there was a weight problem before it took off for Dryden.
I just know in Thunder Bay, when we left off there, we sat there for about an hour just waiting until the pilot announced we had to take off some fuel because they were overweight.
We haven't even had any clues that have been put forth as a possible reason for the accident. And I think wisely we're trying not to speculate.
The 2 badly charred flight recorders were recovered by investigators this afternoon. Meanwhile, Air Ontario officials are busy searching for next of kin to notify the families of the tragedy that so far no one can explain. Gary Reeves, CBS News, Dryden, Ontario.
And still ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, Mikhail Gorbachev reaches a milestone, and later in our Washington Notebook, the debate over sharing U.S. technology with Japan.
Hearty enough to cut through the morning chill, and it tastes your way. It's necessarily Nescafe.
Great coffee blends to taste away. That's necessarily Nescafe.
As both Democrats and Republicans were hailing President Bush's decision to nominate the widely respected Republican Congressman Richard Cheney to be the next Secretary of Defense, Cheney was at work today preparing for a confirmation hearing that is expected to go smoothly. Ron Allen now with the latest on that.
You're ready to work.
Well, we're just getting started.
Defense policy hasn't been Wyoming Congressman Dick Cheney's specialty. Now that President Bush has named him to run the Pentagon, the 6-term representative and former chief of staff under President Ford is spending much of the weekend in his Capitol Hill office getting ready for the Senate confirmation hearings.
I wouldn't want to take anything for granted. As far as I know, everything's going to go fine, but the Senate has to do a thorough job. I'm sure they will.
And there are urgent problems awaiting Cheney if he's confirmed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff met with President Bush at Camp David to talk over some of them, taking their wives along for a non-business lunch. Security advisor Brent Scowcroft went along, but 2 months into the new administration, the key decision maker is still missing.
I'm not on the team yet. I got to get a contract signed before I'm ready to go up there.
High on the defense agenda is the Pentagon budget and how to cut it by some $6 billion for the next fiscal year. The administration is supposed to complete a strategic review of key weapon systems, including the MX missile, the stealth bomber, and Star Wars by the end of next month. There's also the Pentagon procurement process. The president has promised reform. Again today, the secretary-designee was not talking about policy.
I've stayed away from so far. I did yesterday. I'm talking about policy and the issues. You've got to ask. I've got to give you the response, that I'll discuss those when I get before the committee.
Cheney said he will talk over defense policy with Security Advisor Scowcroft when the two meet on Monday. The confirmation hearings are set to begin next week. This time, all indications are the process should go smoothly and swiftly. Ron Allen, CBS News at the Pentagon.
A subject that was all but overlooked with so much attention focused on John Tower is the subject of our Washington Notebook tonight. It is the blistering controversy that came to a head this week over a technology and how much we ought to share with the Japanese. It started out so easily. Japan wanted to replace its aging military jets with models stamped Made in Japan. Alarmed at losing the Japanese market, the Reagan administration agreed to hand over to Japan the blueprints for a new version of the American F-16. That in exchange for radars and top-of-the-line construction materials from Japan. A $1.3 billion program to make this new plane, the FSX, which Tokyo expected Washington to approve this month. It was all set to happen until
the Japanese have pushed us a little too far, and the United States now is going to put its foot down, and the politicians that don't understand that the American people are going to demand this are going to be steamrolled right over.
Suddenly, the FSX was seen by many as the lightning rod, which will determine how we sell our high technology to the rest of the world. The word being bandied about a worried hearing room yesterday was techno-nationalism, a conviction that America has to get tougher about guarding its high-tech advantages.
The era where the United States dominated the world economy and could afford to extend an altruistic hand to our allies without concern for the economic implications of that assistance has passed.
Congress was angry over reports that the Japanese companies that would make the F-16 were also building chemical weapons plants in Libya. But more important was this troubling notion.
This is the starting point for a major industrial effort on the part of Japan that will give rise, sooner or later, to a formidable new competitor in markets that we currently dominate.
It has happened before, first in the automobile industry, later in steel, microchips, supercomputers, videotape recorders, high-resolution television. But all this left the Japanese bewildered. It is a good deal, they say, for both sides.
This technology sharing or exchange of technology is already happening in a very substantial scale in many areas.
Next week, President Bush is expected to approve a revised deal that puts tighter limits on what technology we give to Japan. Then Congress will have 60 days to decide whether or not to approve it. And there will be rocky times ahead.
We're being played for the fool, and it's about time that America quit playing the fool for the Japanese.
What's at stake, ultimately, I think, is the long-term economic, financial, technological security of the country. We've got to be thinking about it in those terms and acting accordingly.
Say if they found that dissidents are being abused. Jan Charlton reports from Moscow.
American psychiatrists revealed today that this Moscow hospital for the mentally ill was one of 7 they were allowed to examine in what became an unprecedented look inside Soviet psychiatry.
We stopped into units and wards. We asked patients if they wanted to talk to us. We asked them if they wanted to talk to us separately, and we also interviewed staff.
2 weeks and $250,000 later, the Americans say they have to wade through a mountain of medical files, and a full report will take months.
To exchange these kinds of materials really is quite unusual and represents a very great departure from the past.
One American team member explained the investigation tonight at a news conference with dissidents, many of whom have fought for the release of political prisoners. But the dissidents were skeptical. That the Americans had a lot of access, said one, doesn't mean there is suddenly glasnost in Soviet psychiatry.
Some dissidents say the visit by the Americans may make Soviet psychiatry look better to the rest of the world, but they do not expect changes in a system they say continues to put people in mental hospitals based on what they believe. Jan Charlton, CBS News, Moscow.
It was on this date in 1985 that Mikhail Gorbachev took over as the Soviet leader. Some of his ambitious reforms have taken hold, many have not. Barry Peterson now with that story.
For Mikhail Gorbachev, at the end of 4 years, it is the best of times, it is the worst of times. There was triumph at the Moscow summit when Cold Warrior Ronald Reagan said the evil empire belonged to a time now past. Bittersweet triumph when Soviet troops came home from Afghanistan. The Soviets did not win, but Gorbachev did. He had the courage to end Soviet involvement. And there is glasnost, the new freedom to speak out, even to criticize former Soviet leaders like Stalin, Brezhnev. That is Gorbachev's triumph as well.
There are people who think he's wrong. There's people who think he's going too quickly. There are others who think he isn't going quickly enough. He's a tightrope walker.
Opposition fueled by unrest. Thousands who have taken to the streets in this new era of freedom. Some demanding independence from the Soviet Union itself. And Gorbachev's troubles are getting worse. His perestroika, the economic restructuring, is designed to help people in farms and factories become independent of Moscow, learn how to produce more. But proposals and promises have not made it so. This is the face of Mother Russia after 4 years of Gorbachev, a superpower even less able to feed itself.
The bureaucrats who were supposed to give up their control of almost everything have surrendered almost nothing. The lines for consumer goods are growing longer. Even the privately owned cooperatives, signs of free enterprise, have fallen victim. Some shut by new government decrees, others burdened with new taxes. The bureaucrats beating Gorbachev again.
They are fighting not for socialism, not for capitalism, not for communism. They're fighting for themselves.
Gorbachev is now trying democracy, an election for a new legislature with people allowed to choose some candidates. But democracy does not extend to Gorbachev's job. Still, if he had to run for another term, would his people elect him? The answer, sometimes grudging, is yes. Because, said a Gorbachev friend recently, at the moment, there is no one else. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
For a better tasting Raisin Bran.
Reach for the stripes, come on, reach for the stripes and get the best taste Raisin Nut Bran.
Today, people are reaching past Kellogg's and Post for the best tasting Raisin Bran. Raisin Nut Bran has juicy raisins rolled in crushed almonds and big, crispier flakes.
Reach for the stripes, come on, reach for the stripes and get the best taste Raisin Nut Bran.
Reach for America's best tasting Raisin Bran.
After rigorous examination of the Mercedes-Benz 300E, one automotive journal concluded.
Church, for the first time, declared apartheid to be a sin. Latin American foreign ministers were underwhelmed today by new U.S. proposals to outright forgive some of the region's crushing foreign debt. They welcomed the proposal, but said they still want their own plan, which also calls for more guaranteed loans. Failure to provide relief of some kind may be a prescription for disaster. Juan Vasquez with more now.
For years, doomsayers have been calling the Latin American debt problem a time bomb. Earlier this month, hundreds were killed and thousands injured in Venezuelan riots sparked by an economic austerity program instituted by the government in an effort to repay its huge debt. It's a problem every country in the region faces.
The result is economic chaos, social unrest, and potentially a wave of illegal immigration into this country. It is directly related to our national security and our economic interest.
Latin America today owes $420 billion to foreign banks and governments. The countries in the region are paying $36 billion a year in interest to foreign creditors instead of building roads and feeding their poor. As the standard of living falls, the misery increases. Conditions are so bad, the United Nations says it could mean the deaths of 18 million children a year by the end of the century.
If we are condemned, if we are forced to make payments that we cannot make, anything could happen here.
For the debtors to get relief, the interest burden has to come down. That's the basic thing that is needed.
The biggest banks in the United States, such as Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, Citibank, hold billions in Latin American debt. Their problem is to collect as much as they can without driving the debtor nations into default.
The banks cannot forgive because if they start doing that, they'll be out of the banking business.
Regional leaders, like the president of Venezuela, say the financial squeeze is driving their countries to economic and political ruin. The U.S. is working on a new policy that will ease the burden of paying so much interest. But the only way Latin America can grow enough to feed its booming population is to keep borrowing money from the banks and countries to whom it already owes too much. Juan Vasquez, CBS News, Miami.
A top Afghan rebel leader met in Rome today with Afghanistan's deposed King Zahir Shah. A spokesman wouldn't say what was discussed, but some rebel groups have asked the king to return home to help form a united government.
When you weigh one diet against another, consider this.
The colonial hats were a nice touch, but the Democratic Leadership Council, mostly party centrists, came here to talk about why the Democrats can't win the presidency. They think they know.
Democratic support is hemorrhaging in the heart of the electorate. We are losing the working and middle-class Americans who used to be the mainstay of our party's governing coalition.
But we also must understand who the deciding voters are. They are white, 44 years old, 2 children, parents still alive.
And we must convince mainstream Americans that we share their basic values: patriotism, civic duty, hard work.
Most of the speakers said that involved being credible and strong on defense, for instance, not just riding around in a tank one day. Be tough on crime, they said. That matters to middle-class whites, too. The one dissenting voice belonged to Jesse Jackson, not a council member, but instead a leader, perhaps the leader of the party's left. He thinks victory lies in expanding the party's base, the poor, unregistered voters.
We have the right vision. We need the courage of our convictions and strong, unafraid, direct leadership. Thank you.
Councilmember Chuck Robb of Virginia disagreed.
And in the perception of the American people, the Democratic Party has not stood for the core values that have been identified this morning.
Away from microphones, Jackson countered, if we become all things to all people, we are ill-defined, indecisive, kind of like warm spit. Robb insisted the party needs the middle class, must go beyond Jackson's base of support.
And if that coalition is no longer big enough to win a presidential election, you've got to find a way to reach out and bring more people into the equation.
The Leadership Council wants a moderate Democratic Party which can win back the middle-class whites who've been voting Republican in recent presidential elections. Jesse Jackson and the left want a coalition of the disadvantaged. This polite meeting did nothing to end that disagreement. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Philadelphia.
Finally tonight, a story about sports and spots. The sport is college basketball. This is Siena against Boston University and Hartford today. And the spots are measles, which is why the stands are empty. There's a spectator quarantine for all Siena games because of a measles outbreak at the school in upstate New York. The fans watched on television as Siena topped BU at the buzzer 68-67. The Saints earned a berth in the NCAA tournament by 1 point. And that's the news. Susan Spencer will be here tomorrow. Later tonight on West 57th, baby broker Noel Keene. I'm Bob Schieffer, CBS News in New York.
In Denver, they speak one language, English. And when Alex English talks, Boston's gotta listen. Nuggets, Celtics, tomorrow.
This is CBS.
Just ahead on 11 News this evening, a woman's body is found on Lake Houston.